I'm delighted to welcome three-time Emmy Award-winning author YVETTE Manessis Corporon, who is going to tell her story as directed or as helped by Dr. Miriam Klein-Kasanoff. So I'm going to now throw it to Dr. Kasanoff and she will take it from here.
Thank you, thank you. YVETTE, do you remember coming to Miami 5 years ago and speaking to 150 of my University of Miami Holocaust teacher students who were learning how to teach the Holocaust? Do you remember that incident?
Of course I do, because I remember that my schedule was so crazy that I had canceled all my book appearances. But once you told me that it was teachers, I said, I have to be there. And I actually rearranged everything and I came and I met you, and it was a wonderful, wonderful event.
And to the audience, she impressed our audience and our teachers so much that, Olivia, I'm just so thrilled that you found her again and invited her. Let me give a little historical overview background to this story, and then we will have YVETTE carry on from there. YVETTE, I'd like to read you a beautiful review. Congratulations from Kirkus. And so, quote, it says, there was a small island near the larger Adriatic island of Corfu, Erikusa, served as an unlikely refuge when, as Allied forces advanced, the Nazis rounded up the entire Jewish population of Corfu, and they sent them by boat and train to Auschwitz. Maybe 1 in 10 of those Jews survived, and that was thanks to Christians who hid them away, often in plain sight, telling Jewish children to answer to Christian names. From now on, they said, your name is Nikos, do you understand? Said one of the rescuers. If the soldiers hear the name Daniel or David, they will know you are Jewish and they will take you from us. In a place marked by the old blood libels and ethnic uneasiness, the act was nothing short of heroic. When the Allied soldiers finally arrived in 1944, many of the remaining Jews that survived, that were hidden, began to disperse, finding homes in Israel and other lands. It took the author, YVETTE Corporon, years to finally connect her grandmother's occasional stories that she would tell her when she was living with her as a teenager to these larger events. And when, as an adult, she finally did, she began to retrace them, traveling to places such as Yad Vashem and Israel's Holocaust Memorial, and back to Erikusa to find out just where was this family that your mother saved, your grandmother. So let's start there. Let's go from the beginning. Tell us how this connection happened. But first, tell us about your early years as a teenager living with your grandmother and being in the kitchen with her and baking with her on Sundays and hearing her stories about a Jewish family that she saved. Tell us about that.
Thank you, Miriam. Yes, it's as Miriam said, you know, I was very, very close with my grandmother. I will tell you a little bit about her. My grandmother was born and raised in Greece on our little tiny island called Erikusa. She was not educated. She had never traveled anywhere. And she couldn't read or write. And she was born and raised to be a God-fearing Greek Orthodox woman, wife, mother, daughter, grandmother. And like so many others in our culture, when my grandfather passed away, my grandmother came to live with us here in New York. And we were very, very close. I spent all my time with her. I grew up in New Rochelle, New York. I don't know if any of you are from New Rochelle there today, but New Rochelle is a very, very, predominantly Jewish community when I was growing up. And I was one of the only Greek kids in the neighborhood. And all of my friends had nanas and boobies who, summered, wintered in Boca and took them to Bloomingdale's and, made Rice Krispie treats. And my yaya didn't speak any English, never learned how to drive a car, always wore her widow's black, and was very different than all of my friends' grandmothers. And I would look at all of the other grandmothers and all of the other experiences, and I'd say, God, I want what they have. I want to be like everyone else. And I loved my grandmother dearly, but it wasn't always fun to be the lonely Greek girl in a very predominantly Jewish community. And I wanted very much to be like everyone else. That said, I then would come to realize just how similar the Greeks and the Jews are. So this was all kind of meant to be beshert, as I learned through the years, because my yaya would cook with me, and she would make all these delicious Greek delicacies with me, simple island food, and tell me stories about what life was like back in Greece. And some of her favorite stories that she would have to share with us were some of the stories about what happened during World War II. My grandfather, like so many men at the time, left Greece to come to America to work in the diners. We all know the Greek diners, right? Well, so many men at that time left Greece and left their families behind to come to the United States and make money and eventually send for his family. My grandfather did that, but then war broke out and he couldn't return. So my grandmother was left alone on Erikusa to raise her children during the occupation. And she loved nothing more than to tell me what life was like, how challenging it was, how difficult it was, how they had no money, how they were very isolated. Erikusa is about 7 miles from the main cosmopolitan island of Corfu. There were no roads, there were no cars, there was no electricity, no doctor, no police, nothing, very isolated and provincial. And one of the stories that my grandmother loved to tell me about this time, this very challenging time in her life, was how during the German occupation, there was a Jewish family, a tailor named Savas Israel. He was my grandmother's friend, and he had 3 daughters who were very, very close to my grandmother. And my grandmother told me how during this time, everybody on the island of Erikusa worked together to hide and save this family. And when she told me this story, it sounds extraordinary now, and it is extraordinary, but in the context of growing up, it was just another story from the time. She never realized how significant it was. It was just another story. And I never realized how significant it was and how important it was until later when I grew up and I became a journalist. And actually first, I was a journalism student. And during my college years, I traveled to Israel, to Yad Vashem. And I remember walking through the Garden of the Righteous. And I remember looking at the plaques and the trees and hearing the stories of how these Christians risked everything to save their Jewish friends. And my grandmother had done just that. My grandmother had told me stories about how at night, Savas and his daughters who were being hidden in the priest's home, the daughters would leave their home and make it to my grandmother's house under cover of darkness, of course. And they would knock on the door and my grandmother would let them in. And she would always have food for them that she took from her own children's mouths to feed her friends. And even though the Nazis told them, the Nazis were actually in our home, my father remembers the Nazis ransacking our house, saying, "Where are you hiding the Jews? We know you're hiding Jews. We'll kill you and everyone on this island." Despite that, every single night, my grandmother welcomed her Jewish friends into her home and
So
fed.
Yvette, you said something about the Garden of the Righteous, and I just
Yes.
wanted to explain to the audience, most people know that in Yad Vashem, the Garden of the Righteous is dedicated to righteous Gentiles who save Jews. So as you're telling this story in chapter 2, you actually talk about the Jews of Corfu. Tell us a little bit about that in 1944. Give us a little historical context and geography, and perhaps show us a picture or two, telling us a little bit about how many Jews do you know actually lived there at that time, and
Absolutely.
how their interaction was with people like your grandmother and the people who weren't Jewish.
Sure thing. I just want to go back to one quick moment. As you discussed about the Garden of the Righteous at Yad Vashem, the one note that I want to make there before I move on is that I visited Yad Vashem. I learned the history. I studied the Holocaust, but never once did I put 2 and 2 together. Never once did I realize that the story my grandmother had told me about how she helped save a Jewish family was as significant as all these other stories. It wasn't until I became an adult and I started researching, as Miriam said, into the Jewish community of Corfu, that I just realized how special and how extraordinary this was, and that there was actually history in my home. When I realized that as an adult, that's when I started digging into the history of the Jewish community of Corfu. Now, for those of you who may or may not have visited Greece or been fortunate enough to, I hope that if you have not yet, you will one day. Our beautiful island of Corfu is very lush and green. It's unlike many of the typical whitewashed, dry, arid Greek islands. It's lush and green and has a beautiful, rich history. It was invaded by the Venetians and the French and the British, so it has a very hybrid, cultural, rich history. Well, among that rich history is a very rich, vibrant Jewish community that thrived on Corfu for centuries. There's actually a Jewish quarter called the YVETTE, which is where the Jews live, and the cobblestone narrow alleyways of Corfu was a thriving Jewish community at the time of the German occupation. Now, at the time in the 1940s, there was about 2,000 Jews living in Corfu. They were as Greek as my own family. They had lived there as long as my own family, as many generations as my own family. But of course, the Nazis didn't see it that way. At the time, there were 3 synagogues in Corfu. After the war, there was 1 left standing. The other 2 were destroyed by Allied bombs. And during the time of the German occupation, it was, as you saw in that video, the Germans realized that time was running out and they were going to be defeated. And so they ultimately decided that they were going to address the issue of the Jewish community of Corfu. And they sent, of the 2,000 Corfu Jews, they sent 1,800 of them to their deaths at Auschwitz. From those that went to Auschwitz, I think 21 came back to Corfu. There were also close to 200 that survived the Holocaust that were not sent to Auschwitz, many of whom hid in the hills and many of whom were hidden by their Christian friends, like my grandmother. So the history of the Jews of Corfu is devastating. It's absolutely devastating because while there were many Christians who did stand up, like my grandmother, like this entire island of Arequipa, there were also those who didn't. I interviewed Holocaust survivors from Corfu. I spent a lot of time with them in researching this book. And so many of them said, we only wish that more people would have done what happened on that island, what your grandmother did, because people were afraid and they did not stand up. They didn't do the right thing. And some Christians turned in their Jewish friends. But there were dozens and dozens and dozens of Greek Christians who stood up and did the right thing and risked their own lives to save their Jewish friends. And my grandmother and this entire island community was thankfully one of them.
It's a beautiful story. Do you want to show us some pictures that you have of the Jews of Corfu?
Sure. I think we're going to run through Matthew, shall we run through the photos now?
Or we can wait till later.
Let's wait until later. Let's wait till later. We can run through them all.
Okay, perfect. So in chapter 7, you call it Yaya. Is that what you called your grandmother? Yaya? Is that the Greek term?
Yes.
Okay, so you call that chapter Yaya Never Told Us. Tell us what she never told you. Some details about the rescue or of hiding the Jews, this particular Jewish family.
Yes, so she really never discussed it at length. She would come and tell me, oh, come sit with me, let's talk a little bit. And she would mention it to me. Oh, there was a Jewish family and they were our friends and I was very friendly with the daughters. But then that was it. That was the end of the story. And I, in my youth and my, silliness of youth, never realized the significance of the story and never asked, never prodded, never asked questions. Mm-hmm. And guilt stayed with me, has stayed with me, and was such such a big part of this journey to find this family, because I felt like I needed to finish my grandmother's story. Because as I said earlier, while she was proud of her part in saving her friends, nobody realized the significance of what occurred on that island. Nobody, not my grandmother, not any of the other islanders. Now, mind you, this was an entire island community who did not say a word. I mentioned that the Nazis were in my home. My father remembers them. My grandmother remembers them. They would go from house to house, knocking on doors, searching for Jews and telling the islanders, we will kill you and your entire family. We'll burn down this island. They went from house to house to house, and not one of the islanders gave up the secret of Savas and his girls. Not one islander told the Germans that a Jewish family was hiding among them. And that, if you think about that, an entire island community, even those who didn't want them there, and there were those who, trust me, did not want them there because they were afraid, and they saw the devastation that the Nazis were unfolding all across Corfu, all across Europe, and everyone was afraid. But despite that, as if it was a miracle, not one person opened their mouths and told the Germans that a Jewish family was hiding there, including my grandmother. And then after the war, it was like life went on. And for the most part, people forgot the story of Savas and his girls until I, in my big mouth, kind of started sharing it with the world.
Isn't that incredible that we don't know about the graciousness of the Greek Orthodox community? And, you know, when we talk today about being an upstander instead of a bystander, surely that's a beautiful example. As we move along in your book, the next part 2 then says, searching for Savas and righteous among the nations. At which point in your life, after your teenage years, did it connect to you, wait a minute, now what happened to that family that my grandmother said they might all still be living somewhere? At which point in your life and in your career did you make that decision? And then tell us about how in the world you went about finding them.
Sure. So I will tell you exactly when. It's when I became a mother. And I always get emotional at this point, so you'll have to forgive me. Even after all these years of telling this story, it still gets me every time. It was after I became a mother myself. And as I said earlier, I loved my grandmother and I was proud of her, but it was like, okay, yeah, see you later. I'm gonna go hang out with my friends. So I never bothered to really let the story and what she risked sink in. And it wasn't until I became a mother myself, my daughter Christiana, who's now 19, when she was born, I remember holding her in my arms. And as many of us do, you wish that those who have passed were there to share in your joy and meet your baby, right? And I thought about my grandmother, and I thought about what she did. And I thought about, if that knock came to my door right now, would I open that door and allow my Jewish friends in if it meant risking my daughter's life? If my Jewish friends were hungry, would I take food from my daughter's mouth to feed my Jewish friends? Would I risk my own child's life to save the life of another woman's child? And I have to be honest with you, I don't know. I don't know if I would have the strength to do that. And my grandmother did have the strength to do that again and again and again, night after night after night. And that's when it hit me. That was that pivotal moment, that aha moment that we all talk about of, oh my goodness, I need to not only find this family, find out what happened to them, I need to finish my grandmother's story. And my first foray, my first sort of, attempt at this was writing a novel. I actually wrote a novel inspired by my grandmother's life. That book is called When the CYPRESS Whispers, and it is the story of a magical relationship between a Greek American woman and her Greek grandmother. And the grandmother shares with her the secret that she hid a Jewish family during the Nazis. I wrote that book, which went on to be an international bestseller and translated into 16 languages, inspired by my grandmother's story. And then as I was writing that book, I said, it's not enough to just fictionalize this. I need to find the truth. And I started on this journey, this years-long journey to find this family. And I was told again and again and again, you saw it in the video, you're never gonna find them. But I'm nothing if not tenacious and stubborn. That's what I'm a Greek American journalist. What can I say? It's in my DNA. And I kept digging and digging and digging and asking. And eventually, after years and years of searching, and you can, read about the incredible journey to find them, I did find them. And at first I found a granddaughter in Los Angeles, and then I found blood relatives. The granddaughter in Los Angeles was a step granddaughter. And then I found a family of 5 in Israel, 5 people who are alive today. because of what happened on Edikusa, because my grandmother stood up and said, no, this does not happen here. And because of that, this family, this beautiful family, who now I'm a member of their family, we're very, very close, they had no idea. As you saw in the video, when I was saying, that's him, that's Savas, that's Savas, this family had no idea, because their mother, Rosa, who was the youngest of the girls who was hidden, she was 9 at the time. Rosa was so traumatized by what happened to her during the Holocaust that she never spoke, like so many survivors. She never told her children, she never told anyone what had happened to her and how she lost everyone in the Holocaust. Her 2 sons, Avraham and Peretz, who are my brothers now, you saw them in the video, they told me when I was interviewing them for the book, they said, we had no idea. On Holocaust Remembrance Day every year, the boys were meant to stay mournfully. They stayed in the house, they mourned, they prayed, they cried, but they never knew who they were praying for, because she never told them. And it wasn't until I found them and was able to reach out and open up this wonderful history to them, did those boys realize that an entire Greek island risked their lives to save their mother. And that was the beginning of a beautiful, beautiful relationship between not only my family and theirs, but our entire island.
Was your grandmother alive at any point to experience any of this? Was she alive when you made the decision to start researching?
Unfortunately, no. My grandmother passed about maybe 10 years before I started really digging in.
I'm sorry to hear that. The family, are you saying that they're all alive still, the parents and the 3 daughters? There were 3 daughters, right?
So Savas Israel, who was the tailor on Corfu, and that's how he became, to become friendly with my grandmother, because he was remember, this provincial island had not only no roads and no police and no doctor, but no stores, nothing. Anytime any of the islanders needed something, they would get on a boat, go to the main island of Corfu, go to the Jewish quarter and visit the shop of Savas Israel, the tailor, and he would make clothing for them. And all the islanders for years did business with Savas and his daughters, and that's how they became very friendly. So that I'm just lost my train of thought. What was, Miriam, what was your question?
No, I was wondering myself, and I'm sure the audience might also be, that it's amazing that all 5 of the original family were still living. The mother
actually, I'm sorry, that's where we were going with that. So all of them, Savas Israel actually died and was buried on Edikusa outside the Christian cemetery gate. All of the daughters, the girls, everyone who had been saved on Edikusa had passed away, which is what made the challenge of finding them that much more difficult. Only one of the girls who was hidden had biological children. Only one.
I see.
And that is the family of 5 in Israel that I found.
So we're going to go back to, at the end, to your reunion by showing pictures, but we need to get to part 3, the tragic irony of while you were writing the book, I believe it was, and the connection of finding this family in Israel and something horrible that happened just a few years ago in Kansas City, Missouri at the JCC, which, by the way, the director that just retired there is one of my close friends, Gene Zeldin. So would you tell us about that tragic irony? Because it really brings it to today.
Yes, of course. And this is the part of the story that I wish I did not have to report. So I'll bring you back to April 10th of 2014. And that is the day that, after years of searching, I finally at last found our answer and found this family in Los Angeles. And I called them and I was crying, and I was on the phone with one of the, Sparrow was one of the girls, and it was her step granddaughter. And we were crying. I said, I can't believe I found you. I can't believe I found you. And it was an incredibly emotional experience. And that day I turned to my children who had been watching this entire journey, right? My 2 children, Christiana and Nico, they were 9 and 12 at the time. And I remember turning to them and saying, look what just happened here. Look what your great grandmother did. Don't ever forget what happens when you stand up and do the right thing. Despite all the risks, the threats, everything the Nazis said, your great grandmother stood up and did the right thing. And goodness prevailed. The family survived. The Nazis were defeated. And look at this. How amazing is this? Don't ever forget this. The Nazis were defeated and goodness prevailed. I drilled this into my children, drilled it into them. 3 days later, there was a shooting at a JCC in Kansas. 3 people were murdered that day by a neo-Nazi white supremacist who wanted to know what it felt like to kill Jews. And he drove to the JCC in Overland Park, where my 14-year-old nephew, Reed, was going to a singing audition. His grandfather was driving him, his grandfather, Bill. They drove to the JCC. As they were getting out of the car, this man who wanted to kill Jews assumed that they were Jewish. They're not, we're Christian, as you know, and murdered them. 14-year-olds, 14 years old, going to a singing audition in Overland Park, Kansas, where people don't even lock their doors at night because a man thought he was Jewish. He killed Bill first, and then he killed Reed. And then he drove down the street and he murdered another woman at the Village Shalom nursing home, a woman named Terry Lamano, who was there to visit her mother. It was Palm Sunday. She was visiting her mother before going to Palm Sunday services. Terry Lamano also is not Jewish. He assumed because she was at Village Shalom that she too was Jewish. This man, this monster, who wanted to know what it was to kill Jews, murdered 3 Christians that day. 3 days after I found the family my grandmother saved from the Nazis. That night, the night of the murders, you know, it's even now, it's surreal. Hopefully none of you ever have to deal with a tragedy like this in your lives. When it hits your family, it's just it's an out of body experience. You don't even know how to process it. And I certainly didn't know how to process it. And my son, who was 9 at the time, I remember climbing into bed with him, and it was 1 o'clock in the morning and he was awake. And this is how I start the book, actually, by telling this story, because it so profoundly changed me. And my 9-year-old son turned to me with tears in his eyes and he said, "I don't understand, Mom. I don't understand. How could this happen?" And I said, "I know, sweetheart, I don't understand. No one understands." He says, "No." My 9-year-old son said to me, "But no, Mom, you told me the Nazis were gone. You told me the Nazis were gone and that good would survive. How could this happen? How could this happen to my cousin?" How do you answer that? That moment stopped me in my tracks. And that question from my 9-year-old son was basically the reason why I wrote the book, to try to find some meaning, some understanding, because, you know, we're mothers. This all started because I became a mother, right? It all started because I became a mother, and I wondered would I ever have the strength to do what my grandmother did? And now as a mother, my child is asking me how this could happen. And, you know, it's our jobs to try to explain things to our children. There's nothing, you know, journalists, you could take all the Emmys and throw them out the window. Who cares? My job is to be a mother to my children. That's what matters. And I didn't know how to answer his question. I didn't know how to make it better. And I really, really, really wrestled with this for a really long time as to how do I answer that? What do I say? And why? How and why could this happen to us? And I realized that I had an obligation to tell this story and to remind not just my children, but anyone within the sound of my voice who picks up and hopefully reads my book, to remind everyone that, you know what? It's our jobs, like my grandmother did back in Greece, to find the light in the darkest moment. Because guess what? My cousin Mindy, who lost her father and son that day, could you imagine? She lost her father and her son. Mindy refused to let hate have the last word, just like my grandmother did back in Greece. And Mindy launched a foundation. The day that her son and father were murdered, the very first words out of her mouth were in the hospital when they told her son didn't make it. She did 2 things. Number 1, said he's an organ donor. We need to make sure that we can save another life. And number 2, something good needs to come from this, because my father and son cannot go down in history as being victims of a hate crime. They need to be the catalyst for light and love, because that's who they are and that's who they were. And so my cousin Mindy put everything aside in such tragedy, in such dark times, and she now runs a foundation which is all about interfaith awareness and bringing together people of different faiths and cultures and backgrounds to educate each other about one another, because what is hate but ignorance? So if you educate, hopefully you can eventually remove the ignorance and the hate. So that was my answer. It took many years, but I now have an answer when my children ask me this question. And in this book, in my book, I want everyone to realize that no matter what, there is power. There is power in the darkness, and there is power in standing up and doing the right thing, even when everything around you is so wrong.
So Yvette, I'm wondering if now we could perhaps show some photos and have you tell us who is who.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Yvette. That was so touching, terribly touching.
Thank you. So we're going to show you guys some photos that okay, so this first photo here on the left, that cute little dude who's like squinting in the sun, that is my father and his great-grandfather. And this is around the time, this was just right before the German occupation. These photos were taken on Arequipa, and to the right, you can see that is my grandmother on the upper right. As I said, very, very traditional, always with the black kerchief and the skirt. And those are my great-grandparents with her, and my little Aunt Agatha, who was about 7 years old during the German occupation. Now, I will tell you a story about Agatha very briefly. As I told you, my father remembers the Nazis in our home and ransacking, saying, "Where are the Jews?" Well, Agatha, who was 7, was walking along one of the dirt paths on the island where a Nazi came upon her, and the Nazi raised his arm and said, "Heil Hitler." And Agatha was a 7-year-old Greek girl, and she had no idea what that was. And he wanted her to say Heil Hitler in response, and she did not. And so he kicked her and beat her and threw her to the ground. And she, to the day she died, would tell anyone and everyone about that story. So that was my family around the time of Arequipa. If we want to go to the next one, let's see what we have here. Okay, so this is as I told you, I grew up in New Rochelle, New York. This was my high school graduation in New Rochelle, New York. Note the very 80s hair. Thank you very much. And my grandmother beside me after she came here and lived with us. And it was a very, very, very proud day for her to attend my high school graduation. As I said, my grandmother never learned to read and write. I remember there was one kind of poignant, I studied journalism at NYU, and I came home to study for finals. And I remember I have a degree in classical civilizations. And I remember as I was studying for my classical civilizations final, my grandmother, whose bedroom was next door to me, I passed her door to go to the bathroom, and I saw her lying in bed, struggling to read a children's book of myths as I was studying for a degree from NYU from classical civilizations. And in that moment, just sort of who she was and where she came from, and you know how far we had come, and all of the struggles, everything that she sacrificed allowed me to be where I was studying for that degree when she came from nothing and couldn't read a children's book. Very, very, I'll never forget that moment. But that is my Yaya right there. We'll go to the next one. Okay, this is the photo that rocked my world, basically. This is Savas Israel and his family. Now, for years, I had heard Savas, and I never thought I would find them. And then when I ultimately found the family, they sent me this photo. That is Savas Israel, the tailor, with very handsome man with the mustache. Seated is his wife, who actually died before the German occupation. And then the little boy on the left is his son, who was actually murdered by partisans. And the little girl in the back with the dark hair, right behind the little boy, she actually was killed along with her children when they were captured by the Nazis in Italy, where she was living in Trieste. And the other children survived, and those are the girls who were hidden on Arequipa. So that, when this photo was sent to me in my inbox, was a big day. This is a photo of the children in the Jewish community of Corfu. As I told you, it was a thriving community. I think this was taken around 1930 or so, so right before the German occupation. And as I said, there were 3 synagogues, you know, before the war, and then afterwards there was only one, which was also damaged and now has been built and renovated through the past several years. But I mean, it was a beautiful, thriving community. And I say all the time, they were as Greek as my own family. I think we'll go to the next one. Okay, so this is right there in the center. That is little Rosa, who was the youngest of the children who was saved on Edikusa. And that is a photo that her son sent me after I found them. And again, they had no idea of our history. And that's Rosa celebrating Purim in Corfu before, of course, the Nazis came and destroyed everything. Okay, this moment here. So one of the most unbelievable portions of the story is after I found the family, we had a reunion. We all met on Corfu and on Edikusa, and we were able to bring them to Corfu and Edikusa. And we not only met for the first time, but they got to see where their family was from, where their mothers were saved, and they got to walk the streets in the Jewish community of Corfu and see where their roots were from. But not only that, we were actually able to find the grave of Savas Israel. As I told you earlier, Savas was originally buried on Edikusa outside the Christian cemetery gate. Eventually, after relocating in Israel, two of his daughters came back to try to move his grave from Edikusa to Israel. One of them became sick, and they ran out of money and basically were not able to bring him home to Israel. And he ended up being buried in Corfu in a Jewish cemetery. And he was lost to history. No one knew who he was, where he was, because again, no one talked about the story. The surviving girls didn't discuss it. And it wasn't until we started digging, and with the help of my friends at My Heritage, we were actually able to find the grave of Savas Israel and bring his family members to the grave where they said Kaddish. And finally, we were able to kind of bring the story full circle. And that was a very, very profound and deeply moving moment for me. And this is our families together on Corfu. These are Rose's children and grandchildren, and me and my children, and my brother and my husband. And that is one of the happiest moments in my life. And as I mentioned earlier, since we initially found each other and reunited in Greece, I've since gone back to Israel several times and spent a lot of time with the family. We're very much one family now. I adore them. And in my first trip to Israel to visit them, we went to Rose's grave, and her son said Kaddish at the grave, and I was able to pay my respects. I was last in Israel actually in December for the Hebrew edition launch of my book. Of course, the family came, and then I went to their house and we had Shabbat dinner together, which was just incredible. And this is Reed and Bill on the left side of your screen. They were as close as you could ever see a grandson and grandfather. It was just, I can't even put into words what a tragedy this was. Reed was 14 years old. He was extraordinary. He was about to be an Eagle Scout. He was a performer. He had the most beautiful singing voice. And Bill, his grandfather, was a doctor, old school, Kansas doctor who loved his patients, and every single one of his patients was family to him. And that's Mindy on the right, my darling Mindy, who, had her entire world turned upside down, but then again, really stood strong and said, this is not how our story ends. And she really has, not only changed her life, but so many other lives in the process, and making sure that her son and father are remembered for being catalysts of light and love and not as victims of a hate crime. And that's me on Edikusa, giving an interview for a documentary that we're working on. And of course, that is the cover of my book, which I hope you'll all read.
Thank you so much, Yvette. This was an incredible, incredible afternoon hearing your story and the way you told it. And my deepest condolences on the loss of your family in Kansas. And now I turn the program back to Olivia.